Hey there everyone, so I'm extremely excited to finally be sharing with you this interview that I did with the wonderful author and researcher Dr. Michael Salla. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I've had this interview for quite a few weeks now, I think almost a month. My plan was to actually release it quite a long time ago, but of course over the past few weeks, my life has been pretty crazy. I've been dealing with a whole lot of stuff, so I haven't been able to get it out yet, but everything works in divine timing. This interview that I did with Dr. Michael Salla was on his upcoming book, Antarctica's Hidden History. And he announced the release for this book that's going to be March 25th. So hey, better late than never, and actually perfect timing because this book is coming up. It's coming out very soon. And you'll get to hear this fantastic interview where Dr. Michael Salla discusses what he writes in that book. And he talks about the hidden history of Antarctica, how it was actually essentially colonized by the Nazis during World War II, and he also talks about the ancient history of Antarctica, which is massively fascinating, how there was possibly a geophysical pole shift in ancient history, and Antarctica could have very well been at a literal different latitude, a different spot on the Earth's surface, and then the Earth shifted. So there's a lot of great information here, this interview that you're going to get. And like I said, you can check out Dr. Michael Salla's book, Antarctica's Hidden History, coming out on March 25th. So let's roll that intro and get to that interview. Boom. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and I thank Dr. Salla for joining me here today. It's his first time actually on my channel here, so thank you for joining me, Dr. Salla.
Thanks for having me, Jordan.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk quite a bit about Antarctica today. It's something a lot of people are curious about, and I'm excited that we're going to share a lot of information regarding it. So first, can we get into some of the ancient history? Tell me about Charles Hapgood and some of his discoveries on pole shifts and how that has to do with Antarctica.
Well, Charles Hapgood was someone who was very prominent in the 1950s and 60s for doing some of the pioneering research into the maps of the ancient sea kings, basically these mysterious maps that showed places like Antarctica, ice-free, and so people were really trying to understand how this could be. And Hapgood had this really interesting theory called the shifting poles, or the Earth's crustal displacement theory. And he came out with a book that basically explained the mechanisms behind the Earth's shifting crust, that he was able to look at a lot of evidence showing that this was a phenomenon that would occur periodically. I mean, he's talking about tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, but that the Earth's axis of rotation would actually shift so that the South Pole and the North Pole would actually physically move in terms of the geographic pole from one location to another, hundreds or even thousands of miles. So, we're talking about a pretty radical theory, and Hapgood's theory was supported by no less than Albert Einstein in the time, who wrote the foreword to his book, The Earth's Shifting Crust. So this was really significant because it showed that someone like Einstein really thought that there was a lot of merit to Hapgood's theory. And so Hapgood's theory gives us a way of understanding how a place like Antarctica could at one point have been in a temperate region of the planet with a civilization on the surface, which then with one of these pole shifts suddenly shifted to its present location, where the South Pole is right over the middle of the Antarctic continent, and of course we've got like 2 to 3 miles of ice all over it.
So we're not talking just a magnetic pole shift, which I just saw an article yesterday on futurism actually. So that idea of a magnetic pole shift is hitting the mainstream, but we're talking geophysical, so actually shifting of the continent.
Exactly, and it's a pretty major event because the Earth's magnetic pole, the geophysical pole, or the geomagnetic pole as it's called, that moves all the time, and so we don't experience any great dramatic difference other than maybe compasses off by a kind of percentage of a degree, and the aircraft navigation might have to change. But, you know, with the geophysical shift in the pole, you know, we're talking about a major geological event that has the potential for really disrupting life on the surface of the planet. So, you know, it's a major event, and I think what Hapgood has done is identified historically that this has occurred before, and also kind of like raised some of the mechanisms by which the pole shift can happen. You know, obviously, you know, the Earth is spinning around an axis, and, you know, the distribution of the Earth's weight can influence that spin. And so if you look at something like Antarctica, like presently now, you know, where one side of Antarctica is starting to melt, you know, the West Antarctic region is melting. And we can talk about that later in terms of you know, all of the evidence of volcanoes suddenly coming active and that melting the ice shelf from underneath. But, you know, the end result of that in the next 5 years or so is that the West Antarctic ice sheets melt completely. I mean, just imagine, you know, not only are we going to look at a major rise in the sea levels, but also the distribution of the weight around the South Pole dramatically alters, because the ice, you know, those ice sheets, you know, that go up a couple of miles weigh a lot. So if that's all gone on one half of the South Pole, then you've got a major realignment of the weight distribution over the South Pole. So that could be the triggering mechanism for a pole shift. So, you know, I think, you know, we need to be concerned about this.
Well, I have a lot of questions when bringing a geophysical shift into the picture. I mean, it completely makes sense, because when a top is spinning, just the slightest weight on it will completely alter it. And also, I mean, what was the South Pole before? And, you know, there's a lot of ways we could take that, but I have a lot of other questions for you. Tell me about Lake Vostok and the Lake Vostok anomaly in Antarctica.
Well, Lake Vostok actually is right next to a Russian base called Vostok, which was at the time the geomagnetic pole. You know, the US got the physical pole, the South Pole. They built a base there, Scott and Munzman base, in the 1950s, and the Russians got the geomagnetic pole, which was where they placed the Vostok base. Well, it turned out that the Vostok base was right over this huge lake, about 250 miles in length. I can't remember the exact width of it, you know, 100 miles or so, but a really massive lake. And in 1989, 1990, there was some radar mapping done over the Vostok region, and it was determined finally that there was an actual lake there, a big lake, in 1989, frozen under 2 miles of ice. So, you know, the initial reaction of NASA and most scientists was, oh, fantastic, this means that we can actually do a test for a future robotic mission to Europa, or to some of the moons of Jupiter or Saturn that have water, that have ice, and underneath that you have flowing water where life could live. That they wanted to use Lake Vostok as a test for pioneering the development of these kind of robotic probes that NASA would eventually send to Europa. But what happened the next year was that further radar mapping discovered this huge anomaly about 50 miles in diameter at one end of Lake Vostok. And all of a sudden, everything changed. Now, NASA basically said that it was no longer feasible. Now, NASA became environmentalists. They said, well, if we send robotic probes down to Lake Vostok, then we're likely to, you know, pollute a pristine environment. So, you know, the whole narrative shifted. NASA was saying it would take us at least a decade before such technology could be used, and then we have to consider the environmental circumstances. So basically, it was like Lake Vostok was now off limits. It wasn't going to be drilled to. But what really happened was that Raytheon Corporation, which at the time had the Antarctic support contract, was actually sending covert teams down to the magnetic anomaly to find out what was there. And according to Richard Hoagland, who actually did the original research on this back in 1991, they were basically researching an ancient city. That magnetic anomaly at Lake Vostok was an ancient city, buried under 2 miles of ice, and that the Raytheon employees that were going down there were suddenly getting very, very sick. And so for Hoagland, this was a sign that this magnetic anomaly was probably some sort of, was using torsion field technologies, which have a kind of space-time displacement. And if you're not properly shielded or protected against kind of space-time distortion around any kind of technology, you can get very, very sick. And so that's what was happening to the Raytheon employees. And so Hoagland was the one that pioneered that research. And certainly, I think when you look at the magnetic anomaly at Lake Vostok, it's like, well, that's a prime candidate for a buried city under the Antarctic ice sheets.
Wow, fascinating. So it seems like there's a lot of stuff under the ice there. I mean, not only potentially ancient civilizations, but tell me about what else is being found down there that's at least making it into mainstream science.
Well, the mainstream scientists are finding things that are really kind of very significant in terms of, what's driving the changes in Antarctica. Last year, 2017, scientists discovered 91 volcanoes in West Antarctica that they hadn't previously known about. So that added to the previous, I think it was about 45. So altogether, we're talking about 130, 140 volcanoes, primarily in the West Antarctic region, that are becoming active, that they've detected them, that determined that they're now starting to become active. And as the volcanoes start to become more active, they start to melt the ice sheets from underneath. And what this does is it creates vast thermally heated cavern systems. And this is really significant because it means that, with the thermal energies from this vast network of volcanoes under the Antarctic ice sheets, you can have an incredible network of tunnels, kind of lava tubes, all under the Antarctic ice sheet, and vast caverns down there that are all thermally heated. And this is what the scientific community has been confirming very recently in 2017. They confirmed the existence of this incredible number of volcanoes, which made Antarctica the place with the most concentrated volcanoes system in the world. Previously, it was East Africa. Now, Antarctica is understood to have the greatest concentration. Scientists have also confirmed that there is a vast cavern system down there, which is thermally heated. Mount Erebus, which is right next to the McMurdo Scientific Station, which is the main US Antarctic station down there. They found caverns coming out of Mount Erebus, which are all thermally heated, a tunnel network extending right down into Antarctica. And it's a kind of balmy 25 degrees Celsius. So, immediately it suggests that you can actually have life down there existing, but also it would be a great place to build bases. And so this then kind of substantiates all of the claims of people, going back to the early 1990s when Vladimir Brzezinski was the first one to come forward talking about the Germans having established bases under Antarctica. Well, now the recent scientific research, basically makes all that feasible, because now we know that there's a vast network of caverns down there that are thermally heated, and that at 25 degrees Celsius, you could actually have a lot going on down there.
So in your opinion, did the Germans end up creating bases and doing a permanent exploration down there?
I believe so, yes. I mean, that's always been the big mystery in terms of, exactly what did the Germans do down there. But we know, going back to the official documents, that the Germans did establish bases in Antarctica. In 1939, in 39, President Roosevelt ordered Admiral Byrd to go down there to find the German bases because they were concerned that these would violate the Monroe Doctrine, which basically laid out that no European country would establish colonies in the Western Hemisphere. So they considered Western Antarctica as part of the Western Hemisphere. So sure enough, you actually had an expedition going down there to find the German bases. So in 39, the US knew that the Germans were in the process of setting up bases in Antarctica. Then, of course, as the war progressed, we have all of the stories about submarines going down to Antarctica, building out submarine bases down there. William Tompkins, who I know you just did an interview with and released, I mean, he's an important source because he talked about a group of Navy spies revealing that there were German bases under Antarctica. We've got leaked documents showing the instructions for how German U-boats could actually navigate under the Antarctic ice through these waterways to find these hidden cavern systems. Admiral Donitz bragging about having established a kind of Shangri-La or a fortress in this inaccessible region of the world. And then more recently, we have information that came out as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union, where the KGB released a lot of files. This made its way out into the West. Vladimir Terzinsky, a Bulgarian electrical engineer, he was the primary source for a lot of these former Russian KGB files becoming public, and they acknowledged that the Germans had established bases under the Antarctic ice sheets.
That's fascinating. That requires a whole relearning of history that I'm sure a lot of people will need to do. So that brings us up to now. If the Germans were establishing bases in the 1930s and 40s, are those bases still existing to this day?
Those bases basically became the fulcrum for a German program, space program using advanced technologies, where they basically started doing overflights of the United States in the 1940s, 1950s. So a lot of the kind of UFO sightings, these were German craft, and you can actually see evidence for this. If you look at the original 1947 Kenneth Arnold incident, he saw fleets of these kind of like kind of shaped craft. Well, when you look at that craft and then match it with one of the Horton flying wing craft, it's a match. It's pretty close. So it's like, well, the Germans were flying these things out of Antarctica up over the United States. You have also things like the George Adamski scout craft that he was photographing. Well, if you compare that to a Hannibal 2 flying saucer, again, you have a match in terms of the structure of that. There are also contactees near Honolulu, Hawaii. In 1956, there was a 17-year career Army soldier, a master sergeant, Willard, and basically he, along with other witnesses, saw a flying saucer land in just near Hawaii, just near Honolulu, and the people that got out wore German uniforms, Nazi uniforms, and the craft itself had the kind of German Iron Cross on it and other insignia signifying that this was a German craft. So there's a lot of evidence showing that the German program in Antarctica survived the Second World War and was doing active overflights in the 40s and 50s of the United States, and deals were done. Basically, agreements were reached whereby the US military-industrial complex would work with the German program out of Antarctica because each had something that the other lacked. The Germans lacked resources and manpower, but they had incredible technological know-how about the operations of flying saucer craft that they had begun researching in the 1920s. On the other hand, the United States had an abundance of resources and manpower, but just lacked the scientific know-how on how flying saucer technologies and how extraterrestrial craft operated, because the US were late starters to this. They only began researching this significantly after the Second World War. So deals were reached, and basically what happened was that the bases in Antarctica were significantly expanded into so that they could actually develop very large fleets of spacecraft that would be working as a result with both the German program in Antarctica and the US military industrial complex to establish a future corporate-run space program out of Antarctica.
Wow. So fascinating. I mean, it kind of brings the full picture around, describing how the Nazis actually didn't necessarily lose the war, and that brings us up, to understanding our modern history, and discuss a little bit about the current situation with this military industrial complex and what they're doing in Antarctica now.
Well, one of the important things to keep in mind is that it was German corporations that built the spacecraft for the German space program, both in occupied Europe and then in Antarctica. And that it's historical fact that many of these German companies had worked in the run-up to the Second World War with US corporations. So that after the war, when agreements were reached, what you had was German companies that had done the kind of main work in understanding the scientific principles behind flying saucer technologies, the propulsion systems, torsion field physics, anti-gravity, electrogravitics, all of those things. German companies were the leaders in that. And that US companies then began to collaborate with the Germans, both in Antarctica and in the United States and other places. And so this became the basis for a transnational corporate space program that was operating in Antarctica. So the original German program in Antarctica continued to develop. It would basically ask the corporations in Antarctica for whatever latest prototypes or models for craft would be. They basically, as in the corporate world, they would award contracts. Some money would be exchanged. The craft would be built, and so and then the German program, which goes by a number of names. So one of them is the Dark Fleet, as Corey Good has described it. But then the corporate program, that was the program that was building the craft for the German program in Antarctica. Over the years, it basically became its own entity. It became a separate space program, so that today, out of Antarctica, you actually have a corporate-run program, which uses state-of-the-art anti-gravity, torsion field technologies, antimatter, whatever technologies they've been able to develop ever since the Second World War for improving the performance of flying saucers or these spacecraft. It's all happening in Antarctica, and they're being built by this transnational network of corporations. And this is what is happening right now under the Antarctic ice sheets. And it's important to keep in mind that the Germans very early on basically relied on slave labor. Throughout the Second World War, they used slave labor because they had acute manpower shortages, and the German ideology didn't believe women should be used as workers. So they really used slave labor. And they found also that this was a way for them to be able to maintain operational security. So that continues in Antarctica today. The slave labor was something that the Germans, corporations, basically introduced into Antarctica. When the US corporations came along, they realized that this is how it was done in Antarctica. And so they just kind of went along, and I think a lot of the US corporations are now in this really undesirable position of having secretly worked with the German corporations in Antarctica for decades, but at the same time having used a lot of slave labor, both in the programs, but also for kind of like human experimentation.
Wow, very, very deep, dark issue, but it's very logical, and it kind of begs the question: where do you think they obtained a lot of these people they had used for their slave labor?
Well, originally in occupied Europe, they had a lot of people that they would just that were forcibly relocated into these secret German programs in occupied Europe, and many of them were also sent down to Antarctica. Now, since the opening up of Antarctica, or at the very least since the US military-industrial complex began working with the Germans down there, there's vast numbers of, kind of excess human population, if we want to describe homeless people in that way, that could be used for, that can be kind of taken, that can be abducted, and wouldn't even be missed. This is something that we witness every year, that there are several million people, children especially, that simply disappear all over the world, and most people just don't pay second thought to it, because after all, they can look at the numbers of street children in places like India, Brazil, other parts of Asia, Africa, and if people disappear, no one's going to pay much attention. When it comes to skilled labor, then that's something that it's a little more sophisticated in getting people. But we find also that many people with certain skills that are desired by these corporations in places like Antarctica, that they are also recruited and tricked into being part of these programs.
Wow, that's amazing, and that does also lead me to wonder how, with this idea of disclosure, I mean, there's a lot of things that we're waiting to be told, and we're hoping our elected officials will tell us, but there also seems to be a lot of elected officials who are trying to keep these ideas secretive, and many of them have also been traveling down to Antarctica. We had John Kerry down there on the day of the election, which was very odd, and Newt Gingrich as well. So how does that fit into things, of all the officials going down there?
Well, I think what we have in Antarctica is a place where you have very advanced technologies that are being used by secret space programs, that is run by organizations down there, which we might loosely describe them as the cabal, global elite, whatever term you use to describe them. There are very powerful people that are running these programs in Antarctica. So I think what happened with John Kerry going there during the 2016 presidential election, that he had to go down there and basically, give them the bad news that that their plans to have Hillary Clinton win the election had failed. That the prognosis was that Trump would win, and that they had to get ready for this. And so subsequently, we have Newt Gingrich going down there. Newt Gingrich was the emissary for Donald Trump. He still works quite closely with Donald Trump. And he went down there with his wife, I believe it's Caliste, who accompanied him down to Antarctica. And he went down there as an emissary to kind of like begin negotiations with the elite down in Antarctica. Because, Trump, I know people are all over the map when it comes to Trump, but the bottom line with Trump is that, he's a businessman. He's a deal maker. He prides himself on being able to make deals with people. So he doesn't really care who he's going to make a deal with. If someone has a lot of power, a lot of resources, for Trump, it's like, okay, let's make a deal. So Trump was, he had that approach. Let's make a deal with the people down in Antarctica, and so this is something that that they're trying to kind of deal with in terms of a president in the United States that they don't overtly control, but have to make deals with. And this is, Jordan, this is a pretty, while it might appear subtle, it's a very big difference actually, because a puppet you can control because you can actually have a control file on them and you get them to do whatever you want. But with someone like Trump who, wants to make deals, and Trump is, the real power behind Trump is the US military. They're the ones that are really calling the shots behind the scenes. So, Trump is a figurehead for the U.S. military. He's wanting to make deals. So it's a new situation. So this is what Newt Gingrich went down there to convey. And it's also worth pointing out that Newt Gingrich's wife, Calista, was appointed by Donald Trump as the U.S. ambassador to the Vatican. So right there, you can understand that they are an ultimate power couple, and they have a lot of influence in terms of what's happening in Antarctica and what's going to be revealed.
What do you think kind of deals were made down there when Newt Gingrich went down? What was the Trump administration looking for?
Well, I think Trump wants to basically make a deal where technologies that are down there are eventually released in a way that helps his agenda of basically reindustrializing the United States. Now, I think Trump as a figurehead for the military, the military have their own goals down in Antarctica, and they want access to those technologies. Because the military, the U.S. military, is pervaded by this idea of full spectrum domination, and the U.S. being the world's major superpower, and the U.S. military wanting to maintain its ascendancy over all other nations. It doesn't want technologies being developed in Antarctica that could kind of leapfrog whatever the U.S. Military has developed. So they want access to all of the technologies that have been developed in Antarctica. They want oversight, and so they basically want to regulate the whole thing. And so this is where I think a lot of the deal making is being done. It's in terms of having access to all of the technologies that have been secretly developed in Antarctica, having the US companies and the German companies and multinationals down there kind of start working more with the US military. Also having a lot of the kind of artifacts that are down there in Antarctica revealed to the public, because I think the US military understands that as these dark programs are opened up, as they become kind of open source, that the US military is not going to be left behind in terms of the kind of technologies that are secretly developed. So I think the military does want a lot of these technologies to be released, because then it'll enable the United States not only to reindustrialize, but also bring in a technological revolution where these sorts of things like torsion field physics and electrogravitic, kind of holographic healing, all of these advanced modalities of health, propulsion, all of these things are now being developed as open source in the United States. And this will enable the US to maintain its superpower status, well into the 21st century.
It is a very complicated situation that we have at hand. And, a lot of people don't really have Antarctica in their consciousness. So it's absolutely crucial. It's a pivotal piece to everything going on. So describe to us a lot of this evidence that you'll be presenting in your upcoming book on Antarctica.
Well, there's a lot of evidence in terms of the recent scientific data that has been released, showing things like the correspondence between the volcanoes in Antarctica with the melt-offs, the surface melt-off of the ice sheets on the surface of Antarctica. So that's pretty important, because it shows that Antarctica is melting not because of global warming, but because of all of this volcanic activity under the ice, which has significance in terms of a lot of the claims of bases down there. There's documents that were provided by Vladimir Kaczynski that were released by the Soviet Union. And when we look at those documents, they list some of the German corporations that were involved in the manufacturing of these flying saucers. And so I looked at that information and kind of matched some of these German companies with their US colleagues, and how these companies have been working together in Antarctica for many decades now in building all of these flying saucer craft. And then we have the testimonies of various whistleblowers, Clark McClelland, William Tompkins, Court Wood. Those are three people who have had access to either directly to Antarctica itself or to the German scientists that were working in Antarctica or knew about Antarctica. So, there are those testimonies as well. So the book basically outlines, the historic documents that show things that were happening in Antarctica, that some of the German companies that went down there, how they collaborated with the US multinationals, and how we have the recent scientific data substantiating a lot of the information about what was possible in Antarctica and what is happening now.
Fantastic. And what's the name of your book?
It's called Antarctica's Hidden History, Corporate Foundations of Secret Space Programs.
Antarctica's Hidden History, the Corporate Foundation of a Secret Space Program. Well, I'm excited for that book coming out in March, you told me, I believe?
That's right. Middle to late March 2018.
Fantastic. Just right around the corner. And I'm sure we'll have a lot more breaking news coming out about Antarctica until then. So that'll only get people more excited about your book.
Yeah, well, I think, we really, especially now because it is the summer in Antarctica, there's a lot of things happening down there. So over the next couple of months, we're hoping to kind of hear more. And I do think that there's not going to be that long a wait before a lot of these secrets start to be publicly revealed, and things kind of accelerate from there.
Absolutely. So it's so important for us to get a lot of this information out now. So thank you, Dr. Salla, for coming on with me today. I appreciate that.
Thanks for having me, Jordan.
Awesome. So that's Antarctica's Hidden History, the Corporate Foundations of a Secret Space Program, coming in March. And this was Dr. Salla talking about Antarctica's hidden history and the corporate foundations of it. So thank you very much. Take care.
Aloha.